it's a lot different on the government side. They don't really have any room for that type of outage, if that makes sense.
Oh, of course. I mean, obviously, nobody really has room for it, right?
Yeah, but it's a little bit different because it could be a challenge from a national security perspective. So,
right. Welcome to the Cables to Clouds podcast, your one-stop shop for all things hybrid and multi-cloud networking. Now, here are your hosts, Tim, Chris, and Alex.
Hello, and welcome back to the Cables to Clouds podcast. I'm your host this week, Tim McConaughey, at Juan Golbez on Twitter. With me, as always, are my co-hosts Chris Miles at BGP Main on Twitter and Alex Perkins at Bumps in the Wire on Twitter.
The joke that never ends.
Right? It always pays off, just like our fortnightly news, right? With us is a very special guest, a good friend of mine. I'm glad to finally get her on the show, Erica Cooper. She works for Cisco, and tonight we're going to be talking about GovCloud, specifically what GovCloud is. And of course, Erica has a lot of customers that work in the GovCloud space, so we thought it'd be great to have her on. Erica, if you would please just go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you very much, Tim, and everyone, Chris and Alex. Appreciate the opportunity to kind of join the session today. So my name is Erica Cooper, and I've been working with cloud solutions for roughly about 6 years now. My background is data center, and then also virtualization. And I've started out on the Cisco side, and then kind of migrated into more of the cloud-based solutions, cloud-based opportunities. Because of my background and where most of my customers sit, which is in the Washington, D.C. area, most of my customers are government-based. I do have some private sector customers, what I call private enterprise customers, but majority of them, about 90% of them, are actually government-based as well as intelligence community based. So,
awesome.
All right.
So I guess we should probably just start with the obvious question, since we haven't really covered it on the show yet. We've talked about GovCloud and just said the word GovCloud and kind of skimmed over it, just assumed everybody knew what that was and everything. But actually, I'd like to take this opportunity, especially now that we have you, to talk about, like, first of all, kind of what is GovCloud? Obviously the intended audience is government to some degree, although I'm kind of curious to what level of government is interested in GovCloud or needs to be in GovCloud. And then, and then we can kind of go from there if that works for you.
Sure. So just a high level overview for GovCloud. GovCloud it offers the government an opportunity to place different applications that used to be kind of like what I would call sneakernet. Just you have physical equipment on-prem, and so they moved a lot of their solutions to the cloud environment. Now, what I will say is within GovCloud that I have experience on is mostly Azure. So why Azure? Azure is, with the government, they have a large point of presence with Azure, more specifically than AWS from what I've seen on the projects that I've actually worked with. Now, why do you say Azure? Well, most government entities also have Office 365. So what's the best way to kind of introduce you into some type of cloud-based solution would be that Office 365, and the next iteration would be Azure on-prem, and then, now we offer also some type of hybrid solution, whether it's Azure Hub, and I'll go into that a little bit later, but Azure Hub versus HCI. So it just kind of depends upon, the customer and, what their requirements are. What I will say, one of the unique challenges within the government space is that what you see in the public-facing cloud cannot go into a GovCloud scenario, because there's specific things that only need to reside within a secured environment. So it's like if you access it, you specifically have to be in that enclave for that specific customer. So it's not the traditional cloud, solution. It's going to be like a good mix of infrastructure and then what I would call like a like Tim, like and Chris, like a nailed up tunnel between your on-prem environment and then anything that any resources that I need to access within the cloud environment. So it's kind of like that environment. So I hope that explains it to to the listeners here.
Yeah, definitely. And this may be a silly question. I haven't worked with GovCloud in any CSP that much up to this point. But is GovCloud specifically only targeted at the U.S. government, or is it any kind of global perspective?
Global perspective, it could be, but now I have more experience on the deployments for U.S. based CONUS, but right. I have seen some customers that are international, and one of the unique challenges would be they would still have to, depend upon the agency, they still would have to have some point of presence communicating back here stateside. So it's just a matter of setting that up international, getting all the requirements. The IP addressing scheme's a little different. It's still IPv4. Most customers have not gone into IPv6 just yet, but it's just been more IPv4, and then having that communication link back to some point of presence here stateside in the United States. One of the things that I will say is that when you're looking at the cloud-based solution, especially on the government side, it's going to be, I'll give you an example. One of my customers, they migrated from a what I call a physical host, Dell servers, over into like a virtualized environment, VMware. And then they put that entire application, it took them some years to get that application to be what I call cloud ready. So they moved all of their resources, compute, into the cloud, and then at that point, then we had to come up with a solution to offer for their customers per se. So
I just want to call this out before we go too far, because everybody keeps saying GovCloud. This is just ironic to me. AWS calls their solution GovCloud, and we're talking about how Azure is like what you see the most. I also have some customers that work on the government cloud space, and I think I probably see about a 50-50 mix between GovCloud and MAG, or they call it Microsoft Azure for government.
Yeah, that's right.
I just thought it was funny that we're saying GovCloud and talking about.
I mean, whether we like it or not, AWS terminology tends to be the most ubiquitous that everybody's kind of uses and knows. I want to go back a little bit because Alex and I worked on the NMCI, the Navy Marine Corps intranet. So when you said CONUS, let's be clear for our listeners. By the way, CONUS means continental U.S. Yeah. So there's continental U.S. and there's OCONUS, which is outside the continental U.S. So my question was going to be, for government entities, obviously, that have an OCONUS presence outside, I'm not saying this specifically, but since I worked for the Navy obviously has a huge presence outside the continental U.S. Do you see it differently? Like, and I don't want to get too specific, obviously, because we have OPSEC to consider, but do you see it where whatever the enclave that is coming back to CONUS and then into MAG or the Microsoft Azure for government, or do they tend to, wherever they're at, they just find the closest Microsoft Azure? Because the reason I ask this is because I don't know how prolific and proliferated Microsoft Azure for government is across the globe, right?
Yeah, so most of my customers that have been OCONUS have actually come direct. They actually have their specific connection back into, it's like a direct connection back into Azure Cloud. Now, one thing that is a unique challenge is if you sit here stateside, then at that point in time, you need to figure out when you make the design, what resources are going to be available for traffic coming ingress into that Azure environment. So I will say this much: it is a lot of, from my perspective and looking at things differently, it's a lot of making sure that you have everything in place for security. Because when you're dealing with the government, everything ramps up. Like, you see that CrowdStrike challenge that Microsoft has been dealing with the last few days. It's a lot different on the government side. They don't really have any room for that type of outage, if that makes sense.
Oh, of course. I mean, obviously, nobody really has room for it, though.
Yeah, but it's a little bit different because it could be a challenge from a national security perspective.
I
So
get it.
Right.
yeah, so it's like we can't. Oh, well, you're gonna be down for a few hours, or we're gonna push this patch. Yeah, no, that's not gonna happen. Everything is thoroughly vetted, and then you go through a process, and then they vet it again, and then it's like, okay, now we can push it. By the time they push the patch out, they've something else has come up, another patch has come up. So it's just going to be a lot of vetting and making sure that everything is all your I's are dotted and T's crossed. So.
Yeah, absolutely. What I wanted to kind of go for, because I feel like we talked about GovCloud, but let's talk about it in terms of versus public cloud. So, for example, you mentioned that for GovCloud, they have a specific thing where only certain enclaves can get into certain gear. Is it that segmented where because I know Microsoft runs those data centers, right? They're all discrete data centers, just like AWS and everything. So within that discrete data center that Enclave A is running their cloud workload. Is it to that level where we've labeled the rack and that the people who are cleared for that enclave can go into that rack? Is that Microsoft doesn't have their own people doing that? Okay.
No. And so so I've been doing the deployments for Azure Stack, Azure Stack Hub, and now coming up on the HCI, you have to be cleared. And so Microsoft, they own the contract, own the opportunity. However, they don't go out and actually do the physical deployments and the work. And so when I worked at, when I've done deployments for Cisco, it's, written in the contract that you have to have, what we call AS or advanced services, or, to come in and say, okay, we're not going to do the rack and stack. That's on the customer, the cabling. But, we would have to actually send the cable equipment list cell out to the customer, like connect this to here. And then at that point, when we come on site, do the deployment. It would take a long time because it's actually, putting a lot of different PowerShell scripts, pushing a lot of JSON. Yeah. So it's a lot of scripts that you have to create, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. So it's kind of like, okay, then you got to start troubleshooting and what kind of blew up versus what didn't. The other challenge comes into play is that if there's anything northbound, like a firewall, then you got to make sure that all the rules are set up so that it allows traffic ingress into that enclave. So no one can just go in there arbitrarily and walk in and say, hey, I want to move this to this. So no, it's not. And most of the time it's going to be in what we call a SCIF or secured environment. And then, you have to be cleared, meaning like security clearance, vetted. And then depending upon your classification of your clearance, then at that point you would go and have either keyboard access, or you can shoulder surf and say, okay, make these changes here. No, back that out. Let's change, something like that. So it just depends upon who's cleared and who's not, and what level of accessibility is required. The other thing that I want to point out is that I have never been on site where the Microsoft engineers have done any, and it's no slight towards them. They just know their role. They know, hey, you guys get this up and running. We'll come up and register it, and then we'll help the customer along with you guys to build out the workloads and the resources. Then it's kind of, after we get it up and running, then it's that joint collaborative effort from all different parties. And it's more of the focus at that point will be on the customer and, hey, what do you want your dashboard to look like? What do you want how do you want to specifically set this up? So it's kind of like I would say it's almost like a two-phase approach. You come in and you build out the infrastructure. And then at that point, after you build out the infrastructure, then we sit down at the table with the Microsoft team and the customer and figure out what they want to do.
Yeah. And trying to get like escorts lined up properly if you need escorts into places, and oh my gosh, it's a mess. Yeah. If anyone has ever dealt with that stuff, it is very painful to try to do.
Yeah, it's a mess.
I think that's a great point. And calling back to what you said about the vetting that needs to take place for these systems that are running within Cloud for Government, I'm sure that same vetting process also has to happen for the kind of CSP native services that they're running, right? Including things like load balancers and, virtual machines, what have you. So from speaking from that perspective, do you ever see any constraints with like feature parity? Does some new feature come out that enables something within, I don't know, like maybe vWAN or gateway load balancer or something like that, that doesn't actually make it to GovCloud I shouldn't say GovCloud, Cloud for Government. Does it make it to Cloud for Government within a certain length of time? Is that a constant constraint for you?
Yes, absolutely. And so one of the things so Microsoft, when they actually say, okay, this baseline feature is available and you can go, and so for example, I've done a deployment and it was a nightmare. And so as soon as we finished up the deployment, Microsoft had released a new baseline. And so I had to go back and undo everything we just did for 5 different sites. And I had to spend an extra 2 weeks out on site to get that up and running. So to answer your question directly, when Microsoft sends out their baseline release, they'll tell you specifically, here's all the codes that are available for your load balancers. Here's all the code specific for your, like your on-premise compute, on-premise switches, everything. So you have to adhere to that. Even if they come out with a new release in the middle of your install, you got to go back and undo all that and get it up to code. And so it is a challenge. It is a challenge because if you don't do that, then the customer has the right, and it's in the contract, to say, I'm not accepting this site. And then at that point, it's like either, a military term, go pound sand or just get it done.
So if I'm understanding that correctly, are you saying that the services within, obviously we're talking about Azure in this specific example. Are you saying the services within Azure allow for configuration still outside of the recommended baseline, and you have to make sure that you're adhering to that? Is that what I'm understanding?
So whatever the baseline comes in, so like let's say it's release 22 or something like that, or 2208 or 2408 for the year. If they come out with 2409 in the middle of that, I would have to go back and say, okay, we're going to have to scrap this and start this whole thing over. Because that's what I had to do last year for the 5 sites I had to deploy out for the U.S. Navy. Because it was just in the day that we had the final deployment, I was like, okay, we're getting ready to, we're done. And then like 3 hours later, the account manager from Microsoft, hey, you're going to hate me, but I got to, we got this new baseline release. And I was like, are you serious? I'm ready to go home. I've been on site all week. So we had to stop everything and just completely do a flat out erase of all 5 sites. We set them up in a kind of like assembly line.
So the code that they release that we're talking about is, we know that Microsoft uses a lot of white box stuff, mm-hmm. or white label stuff, really, mm-hmm. Within, it's Arista, it's Juniper, it's Cisco, whatever they could get their hands on, really, in the mm-hmm. racks, right? So is that what we're talking about? Like you're building this for an enclave. You have to run this code that Microsoft's essentially to interact and become part of the cloud, right? And so, and then they release a new version of that software. So you have to go load it all up on all the gear that you've deployed at this rack. Is that? Yeah. Okay.
That is correct. Yeah. And so what'll happen is if there's, associated, like peripheral features, like for load balancers or anything else, we would have to go back and get that same image that coincides with that specific baseline release. Because if you deploy out, let's say again for, version 2408, and 2409 is there. Well, if I upgrade the whole environment for 2409 and the load balancer is sitting at here, it's a recipe for disaster. We tried that once. I was like, well, how come I just can't do an upgrade on the on this entire solution? It's simple, so we should just do an upgrade. Yeah, no, that doesn't work as well as you think it's going to work. Because I've seen that just implode. The firmware looks like it's updating. You kind of leave it in and just say, okay, we're going to go back, get some lunch, or go back and go home to the hotel, get some food, and then come back in the morning. It's still sitting there where you left it at the night before.
Yeah.
So it's just like, yeah.
And I guess it has. I mean, it has to be upgraded, right? Like because the whole thing is it's all about Microsoft's automation engine that's making it part of the cloud, right? So you can't just run it a revision back or something, right? It has to match everything.
Right. Right. Exactly. But it's a challenge. It's just you learn. I'll say this much: I really had to get out of the mindset of like Python scripting and everything else, and really dive deep into PowerShell because
Oh yeah,
Python doesn't exist in the Microsoft world. At least
everything's PowerShell, Azure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So
how do you like PowerShell? So I had to take the reason I ask is I had to take a PowerShell class as part of my cloud computing degree. I mean, it was okay, right? Mm-hmm. It was fine. And part of that class was actually building a whole PowerShell script to load a database and insert users in the database and everything. And I was like, yeah, it's okay. But I'll be honest, I much preferred Python. So I'm curious. I always ask everybody else's opinion.
Okay. I'll say this much. I don't like it as it's not as clean as I would say like Python or different language. It is very challenging but the good thing about PowerShell is that you can Google something and say, okay, have you seen this? And then it's like, yep, I saw this. And somebody on wherever on some blog site's like, yeah, this is what you got to do. Step A, step B. And you see that a lot on the Python side, but it's really more detailed from what I've seen, on the Microsoft
right.
side.
Yeah, Unity through suffering, it sounds like.
Right.
Yeah, and usually what you find is not that the Microsoft documentation tells you this, right? It's always somebody's Stack Overflow type thing where somebody's suffered through it and they figured it out. And now they're going to save you some time. No, you're absolutely right.
Dude, I feel like I see that a lot with Microsoft specific products. And I don't mean to dig at them or anything, but I remember I was building pipelines in Azure DevOps, and there were so many things where I was like, mm-hmm. I have no idea what this does, and nothing in the documentation tells me what this does. It's all the community that's telling me what it does, which is just bonkers to me.
Yeah, no, you're right, and it's funny. I mean, it's an inside joke sometimes when we deploy out for Azure Stack Hub or Azure Stack HCI, but Microsoft writes documentation. Now, they're known as like a PC, Windows, company. But they write out networking and cloud-based deployment guides for the engineers. And it's some of the documentation. I'm like, okay, you can tell somebody that didn't know networking.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Because it's like, what is this? I'll tell you an example. They were talking about routing protocols, and so they were trying to explain, well, this is how you can verify BGP neighbors. And I was like, I already know that. Okay. So it just was the weirdest I just looked at this and I said, wow, can we edit these documentations or do we have to just look at this? Cause this is insane. So it's just a lot of different challenges for Microsoft.
Absolutely. So I know we don't have let's move on to certification stuff, because mm-hmm. one of the biggest things, of course, with government entities is having to get government certified, like FedRAMP and all of the government certifications. So from a MAG perspective, what does that look like from a I mean, you obviously have done multiple customers, so I'm sure those customers have different certification requirements. So does for these discrete data centers, does Microsoft just blanket like, hey, we support everything, or like how does the whole certification process? I wouldn't have thought so, right? So I'm curious what the cert process looks like.
So that's a good question. Now that's the part I really don't get involved with, but I will say this much: for the deployments I've worked with, you have to be FedRAMP, FISMA compliance, FIPS compliance. All of your devices has to be in that FedRAMP. I guess enclave or whatever. So if it's not, like, for example, the UCS C240M7s are not FedRAMP. So you'll never see a deployment until they actually get that certification completed. Or the Dell, some of the Dell boxes are not FedRAMP compliant. So, it's just a matter of, they have strict requirements, and then it's also not just Microsoft, but it's also the government customer too.
Yeah, of
Because
course.
that is so then you're looking at two different agencies, at the vendor and then the whoever the customer will be.
But it takes a long time for FedRAMP stuff to get approved. I'm curious because there's different levels to FedRAMP. Are there products within MAG that are different levels? Like, there's some products that you can use and some you can't, depending on like what level the customer needs.
Oh yeah,
because that sounds like a pain to navigate as well.
It is, and that's why I'm glad I don't get involved with it to that level, because but it's more on what I've seen is more the account team. They kind of handle most of that, but I will say that some of the products from, like I said, from Dell or from Cisco or any other vendor, they just don't. Some of the products are compliant, some of them are not. Like I do know the M7s are not compliant. UCSX, they're not compliant. They're working on it. But if they're not compliant, then Microsoft's like, no, we can't use it.
So, right. That makes sense. I mean, at least in those data centers, obviously, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So obviously, with this might be circling back to a point we may have we probably should have covered earlier. But let's say, what's the procurement process to even start using Cloud for Government? I'm assuming not any old Joe Schmo can start deploying resources in these cloud-based, these government focused cloud platforms. Is there a specific process that needs to go through to even deploy there?
So when you say process, meaning like, are you talking about from a delivery perspective, or just go in there and kind of talk to the customer about from a design perspective?
The first part. So like, let's say I'm a specific agency and I've decided I'm going to start deploying resources in the cloud. Do I have to discuss this with the CSP and get some kind of, regulatory thing in place to even start pushing there, or how does that work?
Yeah. So I've seen it both ways. I've seen it where, the account team, like from either Dell or Cisco, they'll come in and say, hey, what are your cloud, challenges that you want to, partake in? How can we help? These are the solutions that we have that we can help you with that. I've also seen it where the cloud service provider will bring the vendors in and say, hey, this is our preferred partner for this. So it just kind of depends. The one thing I will say is that the compute is a big factor. And with the government, you have to be careful because, of course, they'll go out and they'll solicit, was it 3 or 4 different bids? I think sometimes 6.
Yeah, the RFP process is legendary.
Yeah, it's it hasn't changed. But sometimes they'll solicit RFPs, and what I've seen is sometimes that the most economically priced, meaning like, if you come into, at the lowest rank, then sometimes that'll, get you in the door. That may not be the best solution for your environment. So that's why I've seen it both ways, where the account team would come in and talk, they've got, different relationships with directors and people, key, personnel, but they'll make that, introduction, and they'll say, hey, these are our cloud-based offerings. And we also have seen it the other way, where it's the cloud service provider, in this case Azure, come in and say, okay, this is what we can do, and this is our preferred agency or preferred partner to actually do the work or deployment. Did that answer your question, Chris?
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Okay. No, this has been great. I'm glad we were able to kind of cover this. I know we've talked about GovCloud on the show multiple times, but not really ever really got into, it's one of the things where it sounds like it explains itself if you just say GovCloud, like it's obvious, right? But there's obviously a lot of nuance into it. And I'm sure there's a lot of nuance even between the CSPs and what they actually offer to some degree, although I imagine they all have to have the same certifications. They all have to support the same government requirements, if you will. I would. I think this is a this is a really good start to talk about GovCloud. I'd love to. We'll have to have you back sometime to talk about some GovCloud designs and
Sure.
and what from a design perspective, how you have to design differently. We touched on it a little bit, but I think there's definitely a lot more to talk about there. So, but thank
Sure.
you for coming on the show. It was awesome to have you guys. Any thoughts?
Nothing specific. I was going to ask you real quick. This is kind of a little off topic, but you mentioned this in the beginning. And since I have a similar kind of background, I'm curious. But you said you came from a data center background. Mm-hmm. And I've noticed that a lot of network engineers getting into cloud come more from service provider or WAN. Mm-hmm. Do you think that has given you like more of an advantage, or like how has that helped you as you transitioned to cloud?
I think it's put me at a unique advantage. And I'll say this much. So, although it's important to understand, like the route switch or the enterprise and the service provider, I see a lot of times where the data center world is easier for me to make that transition because I'm familiar with virtualization. I've dealt with Hyper-V, VMware, storage, just all of that. And whereas, an enterprise engineer or a service provider, they probably wouldn't see that. They would not see some of those different, so it's like, okay, well, I already know about it. And that was one reason why I think about 5-6 years ago, I was like, I was doing a lot of Cisco ACI, hyperflex, deployments and stuff like that. And I was like, well, what's next after this? And so I was like, okay, well, and then they started talking about AWS cloud, and I was like, yeah, but most of my customers don't really touch AWS. They touch Azure. And so I just started saying, okay, let me start really looking at this cloud solution. So it was easier for me to make that transition. But I also have a route switch background. I tried to, it took me 4 times to get my CCIE, but the first 3 attempts were on the route switch, now as enterprise. And then the last attempt was on the data center side. So my route switch background still never kind of leaves me. It's always there and kind of like in the background. I just know, okay, I know when to bring it out, kind of use it as necessary. So, yeah.
Great answer. Hopefully, thank you.
Yeah. I mean, if you want, I can go over one of the projects I dealt with for one of my. It's still a government agency, but it's not nearly on the strict as like the IC community. We did a VXLAN, EVPN, BGP, multi-site, multi-fabric solution for one of my government agencies. We're still actually deploying that out. It's not finished, but it's kind of what the government wanted. Was they wanted to have resources available for different sites, and then have the extended across the WAN to other sites locally within the United States. And so I chose for a solution was VXLAN, but then also we're doing an integration with AWS cloud. Now I'm learning that part of it now, so it's been really unique because as soon as I said, well, you guys don't want to use Azure, and they were like, no, we want to use AWS. And so it was kind of, oh, okay. So at least I get a chance to kind of touch that, touch that environment. But I'm right now building out the VXLAN portion, the underlay overlay, and then we have a point of presence, a direct connect between our one of our sites going out to AWS, and that looks a lot different because you have our load balancers, our F5 load balancers, and they do a lot of what is the global load balancer and whatnot. And so that was pretty unique to see that environment because within the other side, on the Azure side, it was very limited as far as just one single load balancing for that enclave, whereas this is global. It's for all of the different sites that we're looking at for VXLAN and multi-fabric. So it's pretty unique. And then the other thing that I think is really unique is Cisco has NDFC, which is Nexus Dashboard Fabric Controller. So it gives you the ability to look at all your fabrics, VXLAN fabrics, and what information is going across. Anything that you want to look at from like, let's say, an endpoint or anything from that perspective. So it's pretty unique, kind of setting that up and delivering that for the customer. So.
Yeah, Tim is our recent expert on Nexus Dashboard Fabric.
I am not. I mean, I passed the Cisco U course for the research get the 26 credits, and I have to say it was an extremely painful experience.
Yeah, same here.
Not the Cisco U piece, just it's not. It's very unknown to me as an enterprise guy. So
same, yeah.
Okay,
but that's a very cool design. I love it. I love to hear more about it. So I mean, multi-cloud, when you start getting into multi-cloud, things get really interesting. That's when we think things get the most interesting. And hybrid as well, right? You were talking about direct connects and whatnot. We definitely think. So we'll definitely have to have you back on to talk about that a little bit more. I mean, obviously to the degree that you can, obviously, without naming names and, showing where the bodies are buried, if you will.
If I do that, you guys would never see me again.
They'd come to our house and put the bag over our head too.
Right.
Yeah, it's like, hey, weren't you on that show with her? Nope.
They'll go all the way to Australia to get Chris.
Yeah. Throw me in the water.
Awesome. Okay, so I guess this is probably a good place to wrap for now. Again, it's been awesome having you on the show, Erica. We will have to have you back. Thanks for joining us.
Sure, my pleasure. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Anything you want to plug or where they can find you?
Oh, yeah. So I'm on Twitter at TechLady, TechLaydee. And, I'm always there. If you got questions, just reach out. And, it's just, part of the IT community. So you got these great guys here that open up the platform for me. So I appreciate that. But anything you got a question about, just throw it out there and one of us will probably get a chance to answer it. So.
Love it. Okay, so if you enjoyed the episode, please follow us on every conceivable social media. Go to our website, click like on our wherever you can click like for us, buy our cereal. And we'll see you guys next time. Hi, everyone. It's Tim, and this has been the Cables to Clouds podcast. Thanks for tuning in today. If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe to us in your favorite podcast catcher, as well as subscribe and turn on notifications for our YouTube channel to be notified of all our new episodes. Follow us on socials at Cables2Clouds. You can also visit our website for all the show notes at cables2clouds.com. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time.